The voicemail came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table of my brother-in-law's guest room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the light change over his backyard fence. My phone buzzed on the table, and I looked at the screen expecting nothing important. It was my wife's number. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail and sat there another minute before I pressed play. Her voice was different than I'd heard it in a long time, not the flat, careful voice she'd used with me for the past 2 years. This was something older. Something I recognized from 31 years ago, when she'd called me from a payphone outside a diner in Chattanooga to tell me her father had died and she didn't know how to get home. "You need to call me back," she said. "You need to call me back right now." I set the phone face down on the table and finished what was left of my cold coffee. I should back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 31 years married to a woman I thought I knew completely. We raised 2 kids in a house outside of Lexington, Kentucky. 4 bedrooms, a screened porch, a half-acre of yard I mowed every Saturday from April through October. I retired at 62 from a regional insurance firm where I'd managed commercial accounts for the better part of 3 decades. My wife. I'll call her my wife because that's what she was, legally, until she wasn't. Had been a high school art teacher for most of our marriage. She was good at it. Students remembered her. Parents sent thank you notes. I tell you this because I want you to understand what kind of life I thought we had. Not perfect, not without friction, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from shared history, from knowing how someone takes their coffee and which side of the bed they sleep on and what they sound like when they're genuinely laughing versus when they're being polite. I thought I knew the difference. The first sign I missed was in the spring, about 14 months before that voicemail. My wife mentioned a man named Slade, a colleague of my nephew's, she said, someone she'd met at a family gathering I hadn't attended because I was recovering from a minor knee procedure. She mentioned him the way you mention anyone, casually. He'd said something funny at dinner. I filed it away and forgot it. The second sign came in July. She started keeping her phone face down. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room. Not consciously at first, just a slight chill that makes you pull your collar up. She'd always left her phone on the counter. Now it traveled with her. I didn't say anything. I'm not proud of that. I told myself I was being paranoid that 63-year-old men who've been married 31 years shouldn't start acting like jealous husbands. I mowed the lawn. I watched baseball. I told myself everything was fine. In September, she told me she wanted to refinance the house. We'd owned it outright for 11 years. Paid off the mortgage early, which was one of the things I was quietly proud of. She said interest rates made it a smart move, that we could access equity and invest it more wisely. She had numbers. She had a folder with printouts. I looked at the folder and I looked at her and I thought about the phone on the counter that no longer stayed on the counter, and something in my chest went very still. "Let me think about it," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "Of course," she said. I didn't say anything else that evening. But after she went to bed, I sat in the screened porch in the dark, and I made a list on a notepad. Not an accusation list. Not a divorce checklist. Just things I'd noticed, written out plainly, the way I'd been trained to document risk assessments at work. You look at the pieces. You don't draw conclusions until you have enough of them. The list had 9 items by the time I went inside. The next morning, I called a man named Percival, whom I'd met years earlier through a professional liability case at work. He was a private investigator, semi-retired, the kind of man who answered his phone on the second ring and asked no unnecessary questions. I told him I needed to know if my wife was seeing someone. I told him I hoped I was wrong. "Most people do," he said. "I'll be in touch." He was in touch 12 days later. He sent me a file. I opened it on my laptop in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because I didn't want to be in the house when I read it. The man's name was Slade Whitmore, 49 years old, commercial real estate developer, divorced twice. He drove a black Land Rover, and he'd been meeting my wife at a hotel in Frankfurt on Wednesday afternoons for at least 4 months. Probably longer, Percival said, but 4 months was what he could document. There were photographs. I did not look at them closely. I looked at enough to know they were real, and then I closed the file. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I want to tell you I felt rage. People expect rage, but what I felt was closer to the cold feeling you get when you're very high up somewhere and you look down and realize exactly how far the fall would be. Not panic, just clarity. The ground is there. It is a long way down. I bought groceries. I went home. I made dinner. I did not say anything. What I did instead was call my daughter. She's 34, lives in Cincinnati, works in healthcare administration. She is practical the way her mother used to be, and sharp the way I like to think I am. I told her what I knew, and I told her what I was thinking of doing, and I asked her if she thought I was making a mistake. She was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said, "don't do anything yet. Just protect yourself." "I know," I said. "No," she said. "No," she said. "I mean legally. Call someone tomorrow." I called someone the next morning. An attorney named DeVos, recommended by a colleague. He was in his late 40s, unhurried in the way that good lawyers tend to be. And he listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 3 questions. Then he said, "Have you signed anything recently? Anything related to property or finances?" "A refinance application," I said. "Preliminary. Nothing finalized." He told me to send him everything I had. He told me to send him everything I had. He told me not to sign anything else. He told me to start organizing my financial records quietly and thoroughly, going back 5 years. He said it with the same tone I would have used to tell a client to document their assets before a merger. Not alarm, just method. I spent the next 6 weeks doing exactly that. Here is what I found during those 6 weeks. Our joint savings account had been drawn down by $34,000 over the previous 8 months, in transfers small enough that they wouldn't trigger automatic alerts. $12,000 of that had gone to a personal account my wife had opened, a loan at a different bank, 11 months earlier. The rest I traced to a series of payments to an LLC I'd never heard of. When I dug into that LLC, I found that it had been registered in the state of Tennessee, and that one of its 2 principals was Slade Whitmore. I sent all of it to Voss. He called me back the same afternoon. "Do you still own your home jointly?" he asked. "Yes. She cannot sell it without your signature," he said. "That's Kentucky law. But I want you to be aware that she may try, and there are other things she may be able to do if she moves quickly." "What do I do?" "We file a lis pendens on the property," he said, "a legal notice that puts anyone searching the title on notice that there is pending litigation. Anyone who tries to buy that house will see it immediately. It essentially freezes the sale until the matter is resolved in court." I asked him how fast he could file it. "By the end of the week," he said. He filed it in 3 days. I also did something else during those 6 weeks. Something that had nothing to do with Voss's advice. I called a man named Aldous Fenn, a former client of mine, someone I'd helped navigate a complicated commercial insurance claim years before, who now ran a small private debt acquisition firm in Nashville. We'd stayed in loose contact. I took him to lunch and explained what I'd learned about the LLC and Slade Whitmore's involvement in it. Aldous knew the commercial real estate world in Tennessee the way I knew insurance underwriting. He made some calls. What he found was that Slade Whitmore's LLC was carrying approximately $890,000 in outstanding debt, a construction loan on a mixed-use development outside of Murfreesboro that had stalled badly, with liens accumulating. The primary creditor was a smaller regional lender that was itself under pressure and looking to offload distressed assets. Aldous asked if I wanted to make an offer. I thought about it for 3 days. Not about whether I wanted to. I knew what I wanted. I thought about whether it was right, whether it was the kind of thing I could live with. My daughter, when I told her, said, "Dad, you spent 30 years managing risk. You know exactly what this is." She was right. It wasn't revenge. It was a legal transaction between consenting parties. The lender wanted out. I had the capital. The market would do the rest. I made the offer. It was accepted. The week after the lis pendens was filed, my wife told me she was going to visit her sister in Atlanta. She left on a Thursday with 2 large suitcases, I said goodbye from the front porch. She didn't look back. On Saturday morning, I found the note on the kitchen counter. It was written on the back of an envelope in her handwriting, and it said, "The house has been listed. You should make arrangements to stay somewhere else. There's nothing left to talk about." I read it twice. I turned it over. On the front of the envelope, in the same handwriting, she had written, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I set the note down carefully, and I called my son. He lives 20 minutes away, works in commercial construction, is 37 and steady in a way that's always made me proud. I told him I needed to stay somewhere for a while. He said to come now. I packed a bag. I didn't rush. I took the things I needed and some things I simply wanted. An old photograph from my desk, a small wooden box my father had given me, the notebooks I'd been keeping since all this started. I locked the door and I drove to my son's house, and I sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I felt, for the first time in months, that I was standing on solid ground. Here's what happened next. The realtor my wife had engaged, a woman named Petra, according to the listing I found online, received a call from Voss's office the following Monday. Voss explained the lis pendens. He explained that no sale could proceed until the litigation was resolved. Petra contacted my wife. My wife contacted her own attorney. That attorney's name, I later learned, was Gareth. He called Voss and, from what Voss told me afterward, opened the conversation with some confidence. That confidence shifted when Voss explained the financial documentation I had assembled, the transfers, the personal account, the payments to the LLC. Gareth asked for time to consult with his client. Meanwhile, Slade Whitmore received formal notice that the debt on his Murfreesboro development had been purchased. He also received a letter from the new holder of that debt, which is to say, from the entity Aldous and I had structured for this purpose, notifying him that the loan terms were being reviewed and that a meeting would be requested within 30 days to discuss the repayment schedule. I was told by Aldous that Slade called the original lender 3 times that week trying to understand what had happened. The first court appearance was in February. I sat at a table with Voss and tried to look like what I was, a 63-year-old retired man who had been planning to grow old in a house he'd paid off with 30 years of work. My wife sat at the other table. She did not look at me during most of the proceeding. When she did, briefly, I recognized the expression. It was the expression of someone realizing they had miscalculated. Her attorney argued at one point that the acquisition of Slade Whitmore's debt was a bad faith attempt to financially coerce a party to the divorce. The judge, a woman in her 60s, unhurried, with the quiet authority of someone who has heard most things, looked up from her notes and said, "Mr. Gareth, acquiring a distressed debt instrument on the open market is a financial decision, not a legal tort. If it creates difficulty for your client's companion, that is not a matter before this court." Then she returned to her notes. My daughter was in the gallery. I heard her exhale. The settlement took another 4 months. I will not detail every negotiation, because most of it was paperwork and counteroffers, and the particular exhaustion of watching something that was once a life being divided into line items. What I will say is that the house was sold, legitimately, with both signatures, as it should have been from the start, and the proceeds were split according to what Voss had established was equitable, given the undisclosed transfers and the LLC connection. I bought a smaller house in a town called Millvale, about 40 miles east of Lexington. It has a covered porch and a yard that takes me 20 minutes to mow. I have a neighbor who keeps bees and brings me honey in the fall. My son comes for dinner most Sundays. My daughter calls on Wednesday evenings. The Murfreesboro development is still stalled. Slade Whitmore is still making quarterly calls to Aldous' firm about the repayment schedule. I don't follow it closely. That was never the point. The point, and I've thought about this more than I expected to, was that I spent 31 years being the kind of man who looked at the situation carefully and then decided how to respond. Not reactively. Not out of anger. My wife knew that about me. I think she counted on it. I think she believed that careful men accept what's handed to them. She was not entirely wrong about me. But she was wrong about what careful means. Some mornings now I sit on the covered porch with coffee while it's still cool, before the day starts, and I think about the note she left on the counter. There's nothing left to talk about. I have never been able to decide whether she meant it as a dismissal or as something she actually believed. Either way, she was wrong about that too. There was quite a lot left to talk about. It just happened to take place in a courtroom. My daughter asked me once during all of it whether I was angry, whether I hated her. I thought about it honestly before I answered. No, I said. I don't think I do. Then what do you feel? I looked out her kitchen window at the street below, at a man walking a dog in the early evening light, and I thought about 31 years, about the screen porch and the paid-off mortgage and the 9 items on the notepad. And I said, mostly, I just feel like myself again. She didn't say anything to that. She just reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment, and that was enough. I still have the envelope with the note. I'm not sure why I kept it. It sits in the wooden box my father gave me, along with a few other things I've accumulated that don't belong anywhere else, but that I'm not ready to throw away. Maybe someday I'll read it again and feel something different about it. For now, the morning light comes through the porch screens at a particular angle in late October that makes the whole yard look gilded. The bees are already at work in my neighbor's hives. The coffee is hot. That's more than enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not to rehearse it, not to justify it, just to sit with it the way you sit with anything that changes the shape of your life. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices my wife made didn't begin with the note on the counter. They began much earlier, in small decisions she made when she thought no one was paying attention. The transfers were small enough to avoid alerts. The personal account was opened quietly. The LLC connection was buried 3 layers deep. She was careful. But careful and thorough are different things, and she confused one for the other. That distinction cost her everything she thought she had secured. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because I think it's the most honest way to describe what I watched happen. When you build something on concealment, a plan, a relationship, a financial scheme, you are also building its eventual collapse. Not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, simply because concealment requires maintenance. And maintenance has limits, and the longer you maintain a lie, the more points of failure you create. She created dozens of them over 14 months. I found most of them in 6 weeks. What I did, the list bendings, the debt acquisition, the careful documentation, none of it came from cunning or revenge. It came from the same discipline I had applied to my work for 30 years. You look at what's in front of you clearly. You don't let emotion make the first move. You understand the tools available to you, and you use them precisely. That's not cleverness. That's just the habit of paying attention, built slowly over a lifetime of showing up to hard things without flinching. My daughter asked me once if I thought I was a different person after all of it. I thought about that for a while. I don't think I am. I think I'm the same person I've always been, the one who mows the lawn on Saturdays, who pays what he owes, who keeps his word. What changed is that I stopped being passive about those qualities. I stopped assuming that because I was steady, the ground beneath me was also steady. That was the real lesson. Not to distrust everyone, but to understand that integrity is not contagious and that the people closest to you are not automatically shaped by it. Slade Whitmore is still making calls about that debt. I don't follow it closely because, as I said, that was never the point. The point was to demonstrate to myself, as much as anyone, that a man who has spent his life doing things the right way still has resources. Not financial ones. The resource of having built something real, knowledge, relationships, credibility. Those things don't vanish when someone leaves a note on your counter. They stay exactly where you put them. The covered porch in Millvale faces east. On clear mornings, the light is east. On clear mornings, the light is extraordinary. I have coffee and I watch it. And I think about what it means to have built a life carefully enough that when someone tried to take it apart, the most important parts held. That's the thing about doing things right over a long time. It accumulates quietly, without announcement, and when you need it, it's there.